Hello, my name is Kendall Klym, and I'm the host for Grief Walking on Books. This is our first Zoomcast designed to look at writing as it relates to grief. And I am an author and visiting assistant professor of English with a specialty in fiction writing at Oklahoma State University. And I'll be sharing with you very short part of a short story that I wrote after my partner was killed by a drunk driver. Our guest is Mark Montgomery, a retired dentist from Indiana who has participated extensively in My Grief Angels support groups, and as an avid reader has read my story, which I chose specifically to kick off the Zoomcast because I wrote it when I was feeling extremely bereft, probably the lowest of the low in my process of grief. And also because the story led me to enter it in the Antioch Writers Workshop contest, which I won. And when a year later, when the contest sponsor pulled out, I liaised with workshop staff to sponsor a writing contest and prize honoring my partner. So it's in his name. And that said, I can only encourage others to read and write about grief. These two activities, I believe, can really help us walk through our grief. So I will go ahead and read first page and a half from Squirrels in the Attic. Nothing in Trevor's bereavement books tells readers what to do when squirrels invade the attic. No words or phrases guide the grieving survivor a month after signing papers to stop life support, through floor shows featuring furry-tailed rodents dropping acorns and poop a few feet overhead at 3 o'clock in the morning. One author talks about taking deep breaths and imagining the spirit of the deceased spouse or partner hovering above the bed. Another says to, quote, imagine walking peacefully with your loved one, hand in hand on the beach. Trevor lets out a guffaw and adjusts his pillow. Obviously not writing for a gay audience living in the deep South, he says. On what beach in Georgia or the Carolinas could we have done that, now or any other time? Walking hand in hand, yes. Peacefully, never. Trevor thinks of how he used to accelerate and overtake Richie when they walked together. They were too fit and good-looking in the eyes of heterosexual society ever to be mistaken as straight, even in their early 50s. Richie said to ignore the assholes. Trevor ignored Richie. The memory of such a scenario, repeated many a time during their 18-year relationship, leads Trevor into another bout of sobbing, this one causing the squirrels to stop their racket. He shuts off the light and assumes a tight fetal position. A few minutes later, just as he begins to enter an alpha state, the noise returns. Instead of dropping food, the rodents engage in a game of scampering and skidding to a stop, the sound of claws on wood like fingernails on a chalkboard. Flipping on the light, Trevor gets out of bed and stomps over to the hall closet. Taking the longest handled broom he can find, he returns to the bedroom and bangs on the ceiling. Not until he's shouted every curse word he can think of in English, French, and German does he realize that he has made tiny circular dents in the ceiling. This is your fault, he shouts to his dead partner, whose ashes lie deep in a stainless steel urn with a repeating pattern of wheat stalks, reminiscent of their life in the Midwest before they made the move 6 years ago to the Atlanta suburbs. Animals are scared of ghosts, but you refuse to be a ghost because you don't believe in them. Well, I need to get some sleep, or I'll end up losing my job. So get your spirit ass into that goddamn attic and do something. A moment later, the squirrels stop. Trevor holds his breath and nothing happens. Afraid that the minute he turns out the light, the boisterous rodents will return, he opens one of his grief books. he falls asleep trying to figure out which stage of grief his latest outburst represents: anger or bargaining or denial, maybe all three simultaneously. The squirrel shenanigans start up again at 5:15 a.m., 45 minutes before Trevor's alarm clock is scheduled to go off. And we'll stop there. That's only a page and a half. But I think that's a good place to stop, because I am referring to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief with some intimations of Bowlby's belief in grief. So you can read the rest of the story on the Pithead Chapel Literary Magazine site, which I've put in the chat screen on the chat box, and that's https://pithapel.com/squirrels with an S -in-the-attic/. So Mark, tell me briefly about your losses and how your interaction with the story Squirrels in the Attic affected the way you walk through grief.
Sure. Of course, I've lost my parents. I've lost an older brother. I've lost a niece, and I grieved all of them in their time. My husband of 25 years passed away a year and a half ago. It was sudden, unexpected, and of course affected me greatly. We had made a lot of plans. And then this past September, my oldest sister, who was my champion through life, I guess you'd call her, a very good friend of ours too, she passed away suddenly and unexpectedly. So that, of course, dredged up a lot of the grief things. Yeah, so of course, yeah, everybody knows the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages, and you think at one point that it's just a checklist, but it's not. It's not at all a linear thing. It's you go forward and backwards, and So the story, Squirrels in the Attic, you would think something else, some as mundane as having to deal with squirrels, but it's just one of those things in life that yeah, if you had your partner or your significant other or whatever, they would be there to encourage you or help you or do whatever. It seems like a simple task to deal with, but everything you got to deal with life, and no matter what, but you got to deal with it without that other person that was there, in my case, for 25 years. So uh, it just shows that everybody handles it a little differently. Yeah, you probably have some kind of stage that you fit into, but it's not necessarily just a given thing that's how you got to do it. There's really no one book, no one formula that can help you through this kind of thing. So that's kind of how I took it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed hearing you read it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's where I'm at. Just trying to deal with life now, trying to redefine what the future will be, redefine some of the plans that we'd made, and try to go forward.
Yeah, well, that sounds like definitely a way of walking through your grief. I don't think we can run when we try to run through grief. I mean, I just keep thinking of walk, don't run, that I guess we were all sort of told to do as elementary school children. As soon as you start to run, you get tripped. At least I do. And I think participating in My Grief Angels support groups online I think that we've come across quite a few people who wish they could go through it faster, but it's definitely a walking process. And people often say time will sort of heal and read a book, and during the time when you want the healing to happen faster. I don't think it's so cut and dry.
Mhm.
How about you?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't run and you can't hide. That's the two things that I found. And um, initially everybody was around and offering help and all that kind of stuff, and that all kind of starts to fall by the wayside. And so, yeah, luckily I found my grief angels and the Zoom groups. Um, they've been a big salvation to me. It's just trying to overcome the loneliness. Is nights and weekends are particularly difficult. I've got my dogs, but they're a big help and a kind of a purpose for me in life. But it just is not the same, and I realize it will never be the same.
No,
But
it
yeah,
won't. What about books? Where do they sort of come into your life as you walk through grief?
I read a lot of things, and I I unfortunately have not opted to pick up books on grief just because, like from the group and stuff, it's so individual, and I garner more from listening to people and their stories, of what happened to them, who they lost, what they did to respond, that kind of thing. So, um, yeah, I there's several, and I can't offhand tell you what they are, but there's several groups that I follow on Facebook that have a lot of information. I've volunteered to do the Twitter feeds for my grief angels, so I've been reading a lot of different things as far as grief and that kind of thing. I was uh, not surprised, I guess, but interested in finding that there are actual biological, physiological responses to grief. That there is really some truth to what they call grief brain. Um, and that kind of thing helps me just for a little more understanding. It doesn't necessarily change things, but it does help. So I don't know. So I know that you write um, and teach. So I'm sure that keeps you busy, but what else have you found kind of helps you to deal with it?
Well, reading. And I don't personally seek out stories. I am a fiction writer and I read mostly fiction, but I have read a good deal of, I mean, I did research for this story as well as others dealing with grief. But for me, dealing with law, I think all fiction, all good fiction writing deals with a certain amount of loss and grief.
Mhm.
And so when I read fiction that it's either something I'm choosing, usually it's something I've chosen for my students that I've read before, and I'm reading it for a 17th time so that I can teach it with eloquence. But I think a lot of those stories come as a result of my own interest in people dealing with conflict and loss. I mean, we grieve over what may be considered the smallest things, but grieving over something small, so it could be losing a belief that you had because you were, I mean, it could be Santa Claus. The belief in Santa Claus as a young child. I never did believe in Santa Claus, but or something along those lines, but that is a form of grief. And when we read about other people handling something that may not be so heavy duty as the loss of someone who was killed in some way or died of a disease, whatever it may be, I think that we are preparing for the grief that we will experience when we do lose our loved ones, and ultimately for our own selves. There's something that's really interesting. I just want to read a quote from one of my favorite contemporary authors who talks about fiction. And so stories, so often when you see a story that's been adapted to a major motion picture that's mainstream, it's all so tightly knit, maybe less so these days than in the past, but life is really not that way. And when we're looking at fiction, I think the author Colm Tobin has some wonderful things to say about it that I can relate books and grief to. So he says, I think fiction lends itself to messiness rather than the ideal, and plays well with the ironies surrounding what happens and what should happen. I am interested in that story, in the gap between memory itself, the real business of being alive, and the imagination. So I think the imagination part is when we worry in the process of grieving. So you've lost one person, and that person perhaps went out on a snowy day and then got sick, but that wasn't ultimately the illness that led to that person's death, but it didn't help, and so on. And so you have a sibling or whatever who's going out without having to go out on a snowy day, and you're sort of having that kind of feeling, your imagination is active. What could happen to this person? This, worrying in the process of what Colm Tobin says, the real business of being alive. In other words, of, getting out of the driveway, onto the street, going through traffic. These are mundane, everyday things that become something else when we're grieving. When we read about them, especially through fiction, when you really slow things down to create a scene that has impact, tension, then you are able to sort of cogitate, realize perhaps where your grief is going at a particular time. And it can kind of help you, I would say. So, I mean, people are often, I remember someone telling me when I was in high school and very upset over something, why don't you read a good book? And I thought, why did you just tell me that? Read a book. Ugh. And now, I'm assigning book after book to university students, hoping that they will read them. They do. They really do. And I really didn't at that young age realize how the act of reading, so that my story of my life subconsciously, simultaneously is interacting with the story that's created on the page. So there's another fiction that's happening that is mixed with, it's that messiness rather than the ideal. And I love how Tobin says surrounding how it plays, the messiness plays with the irony surrounding what happens and what should happen. Well, who decides what should happen? Well, we each do. This is what should happen. I'm planning X, Y, Z, and this is how it should go. And we all know that life doesn't necessarily go that way. So it's a very sort of messy and at times intense process. And when we read, we can sort of relax in the midst of the messiness. What do you think?
Yeah, it's life's not linear. It's not a straight line. It's not the boy meets girl, boy loses a girl, boy gets girl back, happy ending kind of thing
Or girl meets
necessarily.
girl, or boy meets boy, or
Yeah,
person
yeah,
meets
that too.
person.
That too. But yeah. So I mean, there's all kind of diversions and pitfalls, and yeah, and exactly, you do start, playing in your mind. It's the kind of the fantasy of like, well, what if, and maybe I'll do this, and yeah, and you don't know. It's that uncertainty, and I think that and a lot of cases with the movie reference, we like to see somebody be able to climb back out of the hole and move forward, and that's kind of like with grief. I mean, we all encourage each other on the meetings, you know, uh, whether it helps or not is kind of up to the individual person, but it's yeah, I don't know the exact words that I want to say, but it's it's nice to hear everyone's story, and you kind of put yourself in that situation to some extent and think, okay, there before the grace of God go I in a lot of cases, but it yeah, it's life's a bitch sometimes.
Yeah, it definitely is. And so we do need to wrap up.
Oh my, okay, that was quick.
And so, yes, it went by quickly, and I will definitely receive feedback from the CEO of My Grief Angels. So I think each podcast, Zoomcast, is going to be a little bit different. I will have other guests, and my process will be different as I navigate my own grief, and others do the same.
Exactly. Oh, I appreciate it. I appreciate meeting you. I mean, it's terrible circumstances, but I'm so glad that I've met you.
Well, great. Yes, and I'm very glad I met you as well. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.